Fort Bragg, North Carolina, is home to the United States Army Special Forces Command, commonly known as the Green Berets. It's a place where soldiers are trained to operate in the most demanding environments imaginable: jungles, deserts, mountains, urban warfare zones, behind enemy lines. The Green Berets are elite, selected through grueling training that has a failure rate above 80%. Of every 100 men who attempt to become Green Berets, only 15 to 20 will succeed. And then there are the medics. Combat medics in Special Forces are a different breed. While all soldiers in Special Forces are elite, a Special Forces medic takes it further. They train for over a year in advanced medical skills. They learn trauma surgery, emergency anesthesia, advanced wound management, and field triage in conditions where there are no hospitals, no backup, no room for error. A Special Forces medic is both a soldier and a doctor, expected to save lives in the worst possible circumstances while under fire. Sergeant First Class Michelle Michigan Rodriguez had been a combat medic for 15 years. She had served in 3 countries, on dozens of classified missions that she was never permitted to discuss. She had saved more lives than she could count, some in operating rooms before they could be evacuated, some in the field with nothing but her medical kit and her knowledge. She had trained hundreds of young medics who would go on to serve in units around the world. But on any given day at Fort Bragg, if you asked most of the soldiers outside the medical community who Sergeant First Class Rodriguez was, they would probably say, "Oh, just a medic." That dismissal, that "just," was something Michelle had learned to live with, though it never stopped stinging. Michelle's day began at 4:30 a.m., as it did most mornings. She was at the Special Forces medical facility before sunrise, checking on equipment, reviewing protocols, and preparing for the day's training. A group of new medics was going through their advanced trauma management course, and Michelle was overseeing their instruction. She also had administrative work, medical records to review, supply orders to process, reports to file. By 7 in the morning, she was already 3 hours into her workday. The medical facility where Michelle worked was a small operation compared to the main hospital at Fort Bragg. It had 6 beds, advanced surgical equipment, and a staff of 12, doctors, nurses, and medics. But it was the facility where Special Forces soldiers came when they needed medical attention that was too sensitive or specialized for the main hospital. It was also where the most advanced training happened. Around mid-morning, Michelle was in the training room with 2 young medics, a sergeant named James and a corporal named Martinez. They were practicing a procedure called a surgical airway, essentially, learning how to create a breathing hole in a patient's throat when a traditional airway was not possible, usually because the neck was damaged by shrapnel or gunshot. Michelle was demonstrating the procedure on a training mannequin, walking the 2 younger medics through each step. The key, she was saying, is to stay calm even when everything around you is chaos. You have maybe 60 seconds before your patient loses consciousness from lack of oxygen. You have to know this procedure so well that your hands can do it while your mind is assessing other injuries and planning the next steps. You have to be both surgeon and soldier at the same time. She made the initial incision on the mannequin's neck, using smooth, confident movements. See how I'm not hesitating? See how the cut is exactly where it needs to be? That comes from practicing thousands of times. From understanding anatomy so well that you can do this in the dark, in the rain, with your patient screaming and bleeding out and enemy fire all around you. Sergeant James was taking notes. Corporal Martinez was watching intently, absorbing every movement. Sergeant Rodriguez, Martinez said, "How many times have you actually done this in the field?" Michelle completed the procedure on the mannequin and set down her instruments. 17 times, she said quietly. 16 of those patients survived. 1 didn't make it, but not because of the procedure. He had injuries that were too catastrophic. The airway gave him the best chance, and he lasted long enough for us to get him to a hospital. The 2 younger medics were silent, understanding that they were learning from someone who had literally held life and death in her hands multiple times. That afternoon, Michelle had a meeting with the commander of the Special Forces Medical Training Program, Major David Chen. They met in his small office to discuss the curriculum for the new medics. Sergeant Rodriguez, Chen said, looking over some paperwork, I've been reviewing the performance metrics for your trainees. They consistently score higher than medics trained by anyone else in the program. Your retention rate is exceptional. People want to work with you and study under you. How do you do that? Michelle shrugged. I just teach them what I know. I tell them the truth about what this job is, what it demands, what it costs. I think some people appreciate honesty more than they appreciate people pretending the work is glamorous or easy. Well, you're doing exceptional work, Chen said. I wanted to make sure you knew that I see it and appreciate it. It was a kind moment, and Michelle treasured it. But she also knew that compliments from within the medical community were different from respect from the broader military world. The broader military world saw medics as support personnel, important but not elite. The real elite were the combat troops, the special forces soldiers who did the direct action missions, the operations that made headlines. Medics were just medics. That evening, Michelle was in the facility's break room drinking coffee when she overheard a conversation between two junior soldiers from a combat unit. They were talking about an upcoming operation and discussing their gear, their weapons, their tactical training. That's going to be intense, one of them said. But at least we've got good support from the command. Medical should be fine too, I mean, it's just a medic, so hopefully we don't need them, but if we do, they'll probably be fine. Just a medic. Michelle set down her coffee cup and walked back to her office without saying anything. She didn't believe in confronting people over casual disrespect. But the words stayed with her, as they always did. The next morning, Michelle was working on her mandatory administrative tasks when she received a call from the main hospital at Fort Bragg. It was Dr. Patricia Williams, the chief of trauma surgery. Michelle, Williams said, I need a favor. We have a special forces soldier who was injured in a training accident, pretty significant laceration to the forearm with potential nerve and tendon damage. I know you have expertise in peripheral nerve repair that goes beyond what most medics do. Would you be willing to come over and assist with the surgery? This was exactly the kind of work that Michelle loved, complex procedures, the chance to use her advanced skills, the opportunity to directly impact a soldier's recovery and career. Of course, she said. I'll be there in 10 minutes. At the main hospital, Michelle scrubbed in and joined Dr. Williams in the operating room. For the next 3 hours, she worked with precision and focus, assisting with delicate repairs to the soldier's forearm. She knew the anatomy intimately. She anticipated what Williams would need before she asked for it. When the surgeon ran into a complication, scar tissue that was more extensive than initially apparent, it was Michelle who suggested a solution that ultimately worked. When they finished, Dr. Williams looked across the table at Michelle. That was exceptional work, Williams said. That soldier is going to have full function in that arm because of the technique we just used. And I have to be honest, I learned something from you today. I didn't know you had that level of expertise in peripheral nerve repair. Most people don't know what medics can do, Michelle said simply. They assume we're just trauma support. They don't understand that some of us have spent years developing specialized skills. Dr. Williams nodded. Well, I know. And I respect what you do. I hope you know that. That night, Michelle drove back to her small house off base, a modest 2-bedroom home where she lived alone, by choice. She had been married once, years ago, but the marriage hadn't survived the demands of her career. Soldier spouses had to understand that their partners were gone for months at a time, that the work was classified and couldn't be discussed, that the risks were real and significant. Michelle had chosen her career over that relationship. She didn't regret the choice, but she felt the cost of it sometimes. At home, she cooked a simple dinner and reviewed training materials for the next week's classes. As she worked, she thought about what it meant to be just a medic. The truth was more complex than the dismissal suggested. Being a combat medic was one of the most demanding roles in the military. It required medical knowledge that took years to develop, physical fitness that had to be maintained constantly, and emotional resilience that came from witnessing trauma and loss. Combat medics often had higher rates of PTSD than combat troops, because they carried the burden of the soldiers they couldn't save, the decisions they made, the lives they held in their hands. But the broader military culture didn't always recognize that. Medics were support, not primary. Medics were background players in the stories of combat. Medics were, in the eyes of many, just medics. Michelle had made peace with that reality years ago. Or at least, she thought she had. But the words from the two junior soldiers kept coming back to her, "It's just a medic." The next day, Michelle received a call that would change everything. It was a formal call, the kind where someone read from a prepared script. She was being notified that she had been selected for a special commendation. The details were classified, but she would be receiving a formal recognition ceremony in 2 weeks. She should inform her immediate commander and prepare her dress uniform. Michelle was confused. She hadn't applied for any award. There was no operation that had been particularly noteworthy recently in a way that would warrant a commendation. She asked for more details, but the person on the phone said they didn't have additional information, everything would be explained at the ceremony. She told her commander, Major Chen, and he seemed as surprised as she was. "I have no idea what this is about," he said. "But this kind of notification always comes from above my level. It's serious, whatever it is." For 2 weeks, Michelle wondered what was happening. She maintained her normal routine, teaching classes, conducting training, helping in the hospital when needed. But in the back of her mind, she was curious and slightly anxious. Commendations were for doing something exceptional. She did her job well, but she didn't think of herself as exceptional in any way that would warrant official recognition. The day of the ceremony arrived. It was held in the auditorium at the Special Forces headquarters, a large room with stadium seating. Michelle was told to report in her dress uniform at 1,400 hours. When she arrived, she found herself in a green room with other soldiers also in dress uniforms. There were officers, senior enlisted personnel, and a few people she recognized from various units. Everyone seemed confused about why they were there. Then a commanding officer came in and explained, "You're here because you've all been selected for individual commendations based on performance reviews, recommendations from superior officers, and documented service achievements. When I call your name, you'll go out onto the stage. There will be some remarks, and then you'll receive your commendation. This is an honor. You should be proud." Michelle listened as names were called. Officers received recognition for leadership. A sergeant received recognition for bravery during a complex operation. A captain received recognition for innovation in training methods. Then, Sergeant First Class Michelle Rodriguez, for exceptional medical expertise, consistent excellence in training and field work, and life-saving contributions in multiple operational theaters. Michelle walked out onto the stage. In front of the auditorium was a large screen showing a video, footage of her teaching younger medics, footage of her in the hospital assisting with surgeries, footage of her doing training demonstrations. It was clear that someone had been documenting her work. Then a general walked out onto the stage. Michelle's breath caught. This wasn't just any general, this was Major General Robert Harrison, the commander of United States Army Special Forces Command. He was one of the highest-ranking officers in the Special Forces world. The fact that he was personally presenting a commendation meant it was significant. General Harrison approached Michelle and extended his hand. "Sergeant First Class Rodriguez," he said, his voice clear and strong, "I want to personally thank you for your service and your excellence in the field of combat medicine. Your work has saved lives. Your training has prepared other medics to save lives. And your commitment to the medical care of our soldiers is an example to everyone in the Special Forces community." He pinned a medal onto her uniform, the Army Commendation Medal, which was a significant honor. "You are not just a medic," Harrison said, and Michelle felt tears spring to her eyes because she understood that he was directly addressing the dismissal she had felt so many times. "You are one of the finest medics in the entire Special Forces Command. Your expertise is valued and respected at the highest levels of this organization. Thank you for your service. Harrison saluted her, a formal military salute, the kind that signified respect from a superior officer to someone who had earned it. Michelle returned the salute with precision. The auditorium erupted in applause. Soldiers stood up. Everyone was clapping, not just politely, but enthusiastically. Michelle could see respect in their faces, the recognition that the general had just publicly acknowledged what she had always known but what the broader military culture often overlooked, that medics were not support personnel, but essential soldiers whose skills and dedication were as valuable as any combat troops. As she walked back off stage, Michelle felt something shift inside her. For 15 years, she had done her work knowing it was important, knowing it saved lives. But she had done it in the shadow of a culture that didn't fully recognize what medics did. Now, standing in front of her entire command structure, that culture had been forced to acknowledge her value. It was, she realized, exactly what she had needed. The commendation ceremony changed how people treated Michelle, and it changed how she thought about herself. In the days and weeks that followed, soldiers who had previously treated her as just a medic suddenly wanted to talk to her, to learn from her, to show her respect. The two junior soldiers who had dismissed medics in the break room came to her personally and apologized. Officers who had never acknowledged her expertise now sought her input on medical matters. Her superiors asked her opinion on training programs and protocols. It was gratifying, but it was also strange. Michelle was the same person she had been before the ceremony. Her skills hadn't changed. Her dedication hadn't changed. The only thing that had changed was that General Harrison had publicly validated her value. She thought about that often, about how much difference external validation made, and about the soldiers who were doing equally important work but without a general to tell the world that they mattered. 3 weeks after the ceremony, Michelle received another official notification. This time, it was asking her to participate in a fact-finding mission. A NATO ally was developing their combat medic training program and wanted to study how the United States Special Forces trained medics. Could Sergeant First Class Rodriguez travel to Germany for 2 weeks to conduct training and advise their medical program? It was an honor, and Michelle accepted immediately. The trip to Germany was the first time Michelle had traveled internationally for work in several years. She brought copies of her training materials, videos of her instruction methods, and detailed protocols for advanced trauma management. The NATO medics were eager to learn, and Michelle discovered that she loved teaching at this level, experienced professionals who asked sophisticated questions and understood the nuances of combat medicine. She spent her days in classrooms and training facilities, and her evenings reviewing how different countries approached medical training. She realized that the American Special Forces model was, in many ways, the gold standard globally. The level of expertise expected of American medics exceeded what most other countries demanded. When she returned to Fort Bragg, she found that her reputation had grown even more. The NATO training had generated formal reports, which were circulated within the Special Forces community and the broader Army medical establishment. She was now being consulted on medical protocols. Senior officers were requesting meetings with her. Major Chen called her into his office one afternoon. "Michelle," he said, "I need to talk to you about your future. You're coming up on your 20-year mark in a few years. You could retire then if you wanted to. But I don't think you should." "Why not?" Michelle asked. "Because you're operating at a level where you could make an impact far beyond your current role," Chen said. "I think you should consider going back to school, getting a degree in advanced medical science or public health. I think you should be aiming for a position where you're developing policy, not just implementing it." Michelle had never seriously considered further education. She had gone into the military straight from high school and had built her expertise through experience and military training, not academic study. "I'm not sure I'm a school person," she said. "You've been training medics for a decade," Chen pointed out. "You've developed innovative procedures. You've improved protocols. You've taught at an international level. You are absolutely a school person. You just haven't had a reason to sit in a classroom before. Think about it. Over the next few months, Michelle did think about it. She looked into master's degree programs in military medicine, public health, and medical education. She considered the possibility of shifting her career toward research and policy development rather than direct patient care and field work. But she also struggled with something deeper: imposter syndrome. Despite the commendation, despite the respect from senior officers, despite the evidence that she was good at what she did, Michelle sometimes felt like she was being given recognition because she was a curiosity, a female medic in a male-dominated field, rather than because of her actual competence. She discussed this with Dr. Patricia Williams one afternoon when she was helping with surgeries at the main hospital. "Michelle," Williams said, pausing in her work, "do you know how often I hear women in medicine talk about imposter syndrome? All the time. We see the evidence of our competence, and we still find reasons to doubt it. That's not a character flaw. That's a pattern that happens when women operate in male-dominated fields where the default assumption is that they don't belong. How do you get past it?" Michelle asked. "You don't, entirely," Williams said. "But you learn to distinguish between genuine doubt about your abilities and the doubt that comes from external messages that you're not supposed to be there. The first kind of doubt can be useful, it pushes you to improve. The second kind is just noise. You have to learn to ignore it." Michelle took this advice seriously. She started applying to graduate programs. She began looking at ways she could transition her expertise into policy work. And she continued to mentor younger medics while also understanding that her calling might be evolving. Then, in the spring, she received a call from General Harrison's office. The general would like to have lunch with her. Could she be available the following Tuesday? Michelle was nervous about the meeting. She had been in the presence of general officers before, but this was a one-on-one meeting with the commanding general of Special Forces Command. That didn't happen accidentally. The lunch was held in a quiet restaurant off base, a place where Harrison clearly had a standing reservation and some privacy. When Michelle arrived, Harrison was already seated at a table in the back. "Sergeant First Class Rodriguez," he said, standing to shake her hand. "Thank you for taking the time to have lunch with me." They ordered, and for the first few minutes, they made small talk about Michelle's training trip to Germany, about the recent commendation, about her work at Fort Bragg. Then Harrison got to the point. "I wanted to see you in person to talk about your future," he said. "I've been following your career since the commendation ceremony. I've seen your impact on training programs. I've heard from every unit you've worked with that your expertise is exceptional. And I've been thinking about what role someone with your skills could play in the broader military medical establishment." Michelle listened, unsure where this was going. "I want you to consider applying for a position that's becoming available," Harrison continued. "It's a leadership role in the Army Medical Command, specifically focused on combat trauma training across all special operations units. It would require you to go back to school first, to get a master's degree or higher certification, but the Army would sponsor that. It would be a path to eventually ranking higher, potentially to officer rank through a field commission." "A field commission?" Michelle repeated. She had never considered becoming an officer. That was a different career path, a different life. "You could do it without going through officer candidate school," Harrison explained. "You have more than enough years of service and expertise. In fact, you have more practical knowledge about combat medicine than most medical officers I know. A field commission would be recognizing that expertise and giving you a platform to develop policy and training standards across the entire Special Forces medical community." Michelle was overwhelmed. This was an extraordinary opportunity, and it was terrifying. "Sir," she said, "I'm honored. But I need to think about this. This is a significant change." "I understand," Harrison said. "But I want you to know something. In all my years in the military, I've seen a certain pattern. We promote people based on credentials and time in service, but we don't always recognize people who should be leading based on actual expertise and competence. You are someone who should be leading. Not in a few years, if the system gets around to it. Now. And if you're willing to do the work of going back to school and transitioning into a new role, I want to help you get there. After lunch, Michelle drove back to Fort Bragg in a daze. She parked in the lot near the medical facility and sat in her car, just thinking. The opportunity was real. General Harrison, one of the most powerful people in the Special Forces world, was offering her a direct path to a significant advancement in her career. He wasn't suggesting it as one possibility among many. He was offering it as something he believed in, something he was willing to advocate for and sponsor. That evening, Michelle called her closest friend in the military, Captain Lisa Monroe, another woman serving in a male-dominated field. They had met years ago and had stayed in touch despite being stationed in different places. Monroe was now a helicopter pilot at Fort Rucker, Alabama, about 6 hours from Fort Bragg. "Come down this weekend," Monroe said. "We'll talk about this in person." "But Michelle, this is huge. This is life-changing." That weekend, Michelle and Lisa sat on Lisa's patio drinking iced tea and talking for hours. "I'm scared," Michelle admitted. "What if I go back to school and I'm not good at it? What if I'm only good at the practical work, not the theoretical work? What if I get a field commission and I fail as an officer? What if you don't?" Lisa countered. "What if you're just as good as an officer as you are as a medic? What if going back to school unlocks new ways of thinking about medicine that make you an even better leader? You're operating from a place of fear of failure, not from evidence that you'll fail." "But I've spent my whole career in the field," Michelle said. "I don't know if I'm made for a desk job." "You wouldn't be in a desk job," Lisa pointed out. "You'd be developing policy and training programs. That's not sitting at a desk all day, that's using your expertise at a higher level. That's exactly what you should be doing." By the time Michelle left Lisa's house on Sunday afternoon, she had made a decision. She would apply for the officer track program. She would pursue the master's degree. She would take the opportunity that General Harrison had offered. It was terrifying. But it was also clearly the right move. Over the next 2 years, Michelle's life transformed completely. She enrolled in a master's program in military medicine at a university with a strong Army affiliation. While completing her degree, she continued to work part-time at Fort Bragg, overseeing training and maintaining her role in the medical facility. It was exhausting, studying in the evenings and on weekends, working full-time during the day, maintaining her fitness standards and military obligations. But it was also energizing. She discovered that she loved academic study, that she had a talent for research and analysis. Her master's thesis was on innovative approaches to trauma training in resource-limited environments, and it was praised by her advisors as exceptional work. When she completed her degree, the field commission came through. Michelle became Captain Michelle Rodriguez, officially transitioning from enlisted to officer rank. The promotion ceremony was held at Fort Bragg, and General Harrison personally attended and presented her officer's commission. "Captain Rodriguez," he said, looking directly at her, "you've proven that expertise and competence transcend rank structure. You became an exceptional soldier and medic as an enlisted service member. I have every confidence you'll be an exceptional officer and leader. Congratulations." That night, Michelle stood in her dress uniform looking at the captain's rank insignia on her shoulder. It was surreal. 5 years ago, she had been dismissed as just a medic. Now she was a captain and the director of the Army Special Forces Combat Trauma Training Program. The position gave her authority over training curricula for combat medics across the entire Special Forces Command. She worked with military medical universities, with hospital trauma centers, with field training units. She developed new protocols based on the latest research. She mentored younger officers and senior medics. She consulted with General Harrison and the other top commanders on medical policy. It was challenging, meaningful, and exactly what she was meant to be doing. But the most meaningful moment came 6 months into her new role. A young medic named Specialist Ryan Thompson came to her office with a question. He was part of a training class that Michelle had redesigned based on her new research. The training was more challenging, more comprehensive, and more realistic than the previous model. "Captain Rodriguez," Thompson said, "I just wanted to thank you. I know the training has been harder than previous classes experienced. But it's made me so much better at my job. I feel like I understand trauma medicine in a way I never would have otherwise. And I wanted you to know that it matters. What you're doing here, it's saving lives." Michelle felt tears in her eyes. This was what it was all about, not the rank, not the recognition, but the knowledge that her work was actually making a difference in how soldiers were trained and how lives were saved. "Thank you for telling me that," she said to Thompson. "And thank you for doing the work. That's what makes it all matter." After Thompson left, Michelle sat at her desk and reflected on her journey. From combat medic to respected trainer to officer to policy leader. From just a medic to someone who was shaping how combat medicine was taught and practiced across the entire Special Forces Command. The commendation ceremony had been the beginning. But it was her own willingness to accept the recognition, to believe that she deserved advancement, to take risks and pursue education and push herself beyond where she had been, that had made the real change. General Harrison had opened a door. But Michelle had to walk through it. And now, on the other side of that door, she was in a position to open doors for other people, other medics, other women in the military, other people who had been overlooked or underestimated. That would be her true legacy. The call came at 2:47 a.m. on a Thursday morning in August. Michelle was asleep in her quarters at Fort Bragg when her phone rang. For a moment, she was disoriented, confused by the sound. Then her military instincts kicked in, and she came fully awake. It was her commanding officer, Colonel James Morrison. "Captain Rodriguez," he said without preamble, "we have a situation. A training exercise in the field has gone wrong. Real casualties. Multiple soldiers with serious injuries. The medevac helicopters are about 30 minutes out, but we need to make sure medical personnel are positioned correctly to receive them. I need you to oversee the trauma preparation immediately." Michelle was already out of bed, pulling on clothes. "How many casualties?" she asked. "Preliminary count is 8. Multiple serious traumas, lacerations, probable internal injuries, at least 2 possible gunshot wounds from an accidental discharge." "I'm on my way," Michelle said, and she was already moving. Within 5 minutes, she was in her car driving to the Fort Bragg Medical Facility. Within 10 minutes, she was there, pulling on scrubs and meeting with the trauma team that had been called in. Dr. Patricia Williams was already there, setting up the operating rooms. "Michelle," she said, not bothering with formalities, "we're going to need you in the lead position for trauma management. I want you coordinating triage when the patients arrive. I'll handle surgical decisions, but I'm relying on you for initial assessment and priority ordering." The trauma center filled with focused activity. Nurses prepared equipment. Surgeons scrubbed in. The team reviewed protocols for multiple simultaneous traumas. When the first helicopter arrived, everything shifted into high-speed action. 8 soldiers came in rapid succession over the next 20 minutes. Michelle's years of field experience showed as she quickly assessed each patient, determined the severity of their injuries, and ordered them to specific treatment stations based on who needed immediate surgery and who could wait. She was in her element, the practical knowledge that years of field work had given her, combined with the advanced medical training she'd received, and now elevated by the broader perspective she'd gained from her academic work and policy experience. She was everywhere at once, directing the triage, consulting with surgeons on treatment approaches, adjusting protocols based on the specific nature of each injury, ensuring that resources were being used efficiently. A soldier came in with a massive chest wound. Michelle guided the team through emergency thoracotomy. Another soldier had abdominal injuries with possible vascular damage. Michelle suggested a damage control approach that Dr. Williams immediately endorsed and implemented. For 5 hours, Michelle worked without stopping. She drank coffee between patient assessments. She made decisions that determined the order in which soldiers would receive surgical treatment. She collaborated with Williams and the other physicians on treatment approaches. By mid-morning, all 8 soldiers had been stabilized and taken into surgery or transferred to higher levels of care. The acute crisis was over. In the break room, covered in blood that had soaked through parts of her scrubs, Michelle sat down for the first time in hours and literally could not move. The adrenaline that had kept her going suddenly drained away, leaving her exhausted. Dr. Williams found her there and sat down beside her. "You were extraordinary," Williams said simply. "The way you coordinated those patients, the treatment decisions you helped make, 3 of those soldiers are alive right now because of you. You know that, right?" Michelle didn't answer. She was too tired to process what had happened, the magnitude of the work she'd just done. Over the next week, she learned that all 8 soldiers had survived the initial surgeries. Some would have long recoveries. Some would be permanently changed by their injuries. But they were alive. And the investigation into what had caused the exercise to go wrong revealed that it had been a mechanical failure, a vehicle malfunction that had caused a chain reaction of events that had injured the soldiers. It wasn't anyone's fault. It had just happened. But what mattered was that when the crisis occurred, the team was ready. The trauma protocols that Michelle had helped design and that she'd been training people to use had worked exactly as they were supposed to. The soldiers had received the best possible care in a chaotic situation, and that had made the difference between survival and tragedy. 3 weeks after the crisis, Michelle was called to the office of General Robert Harrison at Special Forces Command Headquarters. "Captain Rodriguez," Harrison said when she arrived, "I've reviewed the reports of the trauma response to the training accident. I've talked to the doctors and nurses who were there. And I want to tell you something, the system that saved those 8 soldiers' lives, that system exists because of the work you've done. Because of the training protocols you developed. Because of the way you've approached combat medicine with both practical expertise and evidence-based rigor." "Thank you, sir," Michelle said. "But I want you to understand something more important," Harrison continued. "I've been in the military for 37 years. I've seen soldiers serve, rise through ranks, and eventually retire. What I look for in people I want to advance is not just competence, but the kind of character that comes from really understanding the weight of responsibility. You carry that. You understand that every decision you make affects whether soldiers live or die. That understanding guides everything you do." He stood up and walked to the window that overlooked Fort Bragg. "There's a position that's becoming available next year," he said. "Deputy Commander of Army Medical Operations for Special Forces Command. It's a major's rank, a significant step up from captain. It would involve policy development, budget oversight, and strategic planning for medical operations across all special operations units worldwide. I want you to be considered for that position." Michelle felt her heart skip. Major. It was the rank she'd been tracking toward, the advancement that would represent a final validation of her career trajectory. "Sir, I'm honored," she said. "Don't just be honored," Harrison said, turning back to face her. "Be ready. Because I want to push your promotion through. I want to make sure there's no question that this is based on merit and competence. And for that to happen, you need to continue doing the exceptional work you're already doing. The trauma response last month proved that your training and protocols work. That's exactly the kind of concrete evidence we need to show that you belong in that role." After the meeting, Michelle walked back to her office in a daze. Deputy Commander. It was a significant advancement, the kind of role that would require her to think strategically about military medical operations, to work at the highest levels of command, to influence policy decisions that affected medical care for thousands of soldiers. It was also the kind of role that, 5 years ago, she would never have imagined being in. Over the next several months, Michelle prepared for the possibility of promotion. She took advanced courses in leadership and strategic planning. She worked on projects that would demonstrate her ability to think at a higher command level. She documented the outcomes of the training programs she had developed, showing measurable improvements in medic competence and trauma response. She also found herself mentoring other women and enlisted personnel who aspired to higher ranks. There were more of them now, more women in combat medicine, more enlisted soldiers who wanted to become officers, more people who had been told they were just something and who wanted to prove that just was a limiting and inaccurate description. Michelle tried to tell them what she'd learned, that external validation mattered, that recognition from leaders could change how a system perceived your value, but that ultimately, you had to believe in yourself. You had to do the work even when nobody was watching. You had to develop your expertise for its own sake, not for the applause. In September, the official announcement came: Captain Michelle Rodriguez would be promoted to Major and would assume the position of Deputy Commander of Army Medical Operations for Special Forces Command, effective immediately. The promotion ceremony was held at Fort Bragg, and it was one of the largest military ceremonies Michelle had ever seen. General Harrison presided. High-ranking officers from multiple branches of the military attended. The ceremony was formal, precise, and recognizing. When General Harrison pinned the major's rank insignia on Michelle's uniform, he shook her hand firmly. "Major Rodriguez," he said loud enough for everyone to hear, "you have exemplified what it means to develop expertise, to serve with dedication, and to lead with integrity. You started as a soldier with a medical kit and a determination to save lives. You've become a leader who shapes how all soldiers are trained and equipped to save lives. That is an extraordinary journey. Congratulations." The auditorium erupted in applause. That night, Michelle sat in her quarters wearing the uniform of a major in the United States Army, and she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had accomplished. From combat medic to director of trauma training to deputy commander of medical operations. From just a medic to a woman whose strategic decisions affected military medical policy worldwide. It had taken time. It had required courage to pursue education, to accept a new career path, to believe that she deserved to advance beyond where she had started. But it had been worth it. And the best part was that now, in her new role, she would be in a position to ensure that other medics, other people in support roles who were often overlooked, would have the recognition and opportunity to advance that they deserved. That would be her mission in this next chapter of her career. Major Michelle Rodriguez's new position as Deputy Commander of Army Medical Operations for Special Forces Command gave her authority over the entire medical infrastructure of special operations units worldwide. It was a role that required her to think strategically about resource allocation, training standards, policy development, and long-term planning. It was also a role that forced her to confront something she had never had to face directly before: the gap between how the military system saw enlisted medics and how it should see them. One of her first tasks was to conduct a comprehensive review of combat medic training programs across all special operations units. She visited forward operating bases in multiple countries, conducted interviews with medics in the field, and reviewed data on medic performance and training effectiveness. What she discovered was troubling. Some units were using outdated training protocols. Some senior officers didn't understand the full scope of what combat medics were capable of doing. Some medics weren't being trained to their full potential because commanders didn't believe it was necessary. And most surprisingly, there was significant resistance to new training approaches from officers who had never been medics themselves and who didn't understand the complexity of the work. In one meeting at a forward operating base in the Middle East, a colonel with responsibility for a special operations unit pushed back against her recommendations. "Major," he said, and she could hear the resistance in his voice, "these new training protocols require too much time investment. We don't have time to spend weeks teaching medics advanced surgical techniques when they should be training for combat operations." Michelle took a breath. This was the fundamental misunderstanding that she had been fighting against her entire career. "Sir," she said carefully, "the advanced surgical techniques are not in addition to combat training. They are part of what makes our soldiers effective. A medic who can perform a surgical airway or manage hemorrhage control in the field is more valuable in a combat operation than a medic who can only provide basic first aid. The training time is an investment that makes soldiers better at their jobs." "That may be true," the colonel said, "but medics are support personnel. The real fighting is done by the combat troops. We shouldn't be spending that much time and resources on support. Michelle felt anger rise in her chest, but she kept her voice level. Sir, I would respectfully point out that every major trauma case in a field setting depends on the medic's expertise. The combat troops can fight hard, but if they're injured, their survival depends on the quality of medical care they receive. That's not support, that's critical to the mission. The conversation didn't resolve the conflict, but it clarified for Michelle what she was dealing with. There was a cultural bias in the military that valued combat troops over support personnel, and that bias affected how resources were allocated, how training was prioritized, and how soldiers perceived their own value. She was determined to change that. Over the next year, Michelle worked on several initiatives. First, she developed a comprehensive evidence-based training program that showed exactly how each medical skill correlated to improved survival outcomes in the field. She compiled data from trauma outcomes, from surgeon consultations, from field reports. She created presentations that showed commanders exactly why advanced medic training mattered for their unit's success. Second, she advocated for recognition of combat medics at the same level as combat troops. She worked with General Harrison to establish special commendations for medics who performed exceptionally in the field. She pushed for medics to be included in unit recognition ceremonies, not just attached to them as afterthoughts. Third, she mentored younger medics who aspired to leadership roles, helping them understand that advancement was possible, that officers in the medical field had just as much authority and responsibility as officers in combat units. One of the medics she mentored was Specialist James Chen, the same young medic who had been in her training class years before. James had excelled in training and had been promoted to sergeant and then staff sergeant. Now he was considering whether to apply for officer training. "I'm not sure I'm officer material," James told her during one of their mentoring sessions. "I'm just a medic. I don't have a college degree. I don't have the background that officers usually have." Michelle looked at him sternly. "Stop. Right there. Don't ever use the word just to describe yourself. You are a highly trained combat medical professional with years of field experience. That is exactly the kind of person who should be an officer. Go back to school. Apply for officer training. Become what you're capable of becoming." "But," James started. "No buts," Michelle said. "I'm telling you this as someone who has lived it. You're going to doubt yourself. The system is going to doubt you. But you have to push through that doubt because you know what you're capable of." By the end of the year, James had enrolled in online college courses with the Army's sponsorship. By the end of 2 years, he had completed his degree. By the end of 3 years, he had been commissioned as a second lieutenant and was now training other combat medics using the protocols that Michelle had developed. Michelle's work in her position was documented and analyzed. The results were undeniable. Units that implemented her training protocols had better outcomes in the field. Medics who received the advanced training were more confident and more effective. Overall mission success rates improved. And, perhaps most importantly, the culture started to shift. Officers who had previously dismissed medics as support personnel began to understand that medic expertise was critical to mission success. Other services started asking for Michelle's protocols to adapt them for their own medics. The Army Medical Command took notice. Michelle started being invited to speak at major military conferences. She was asked to contribute to policy documents. She was consulted on decisions that would affect medical operations worldwide. Then, in the spring of her second year in the position, she received an unexpected call from General Harrison. "Michelle," he said, his voice serious, "I'm retiring in 6 months. Before I do, I want to make sure you understand something. There's going to be an opening for the position I'm currently holding, Commander of Special Forces Command. I'm not suggesting that you should apply. I'm telling you that I believe you could do that job." Michelle's breath caught. Commander of Special Forces Command. That was a position held by a major general or higher. It was one of the top military positions in the country. "Sir," she said, with respect, "that's. I'm a major. Those positions are usually held by officers who have spent their entire careers in combat operations. Traditionally, yes, Harrison said. But times are changing. And I believe the kind of strategic thinking about what makes special operations effective is exactly what the next commander should have. You understand operations from multiple angles, from field medical work, from training command, from policy development. That's a perspective that not many people have. What would I need to do? Michelle asked. First, get promoted to colonel, Harrison said. That's something I can help facilitate, based on your performance in your current role. Then, get another assignment in a command position. Show that you can lead at a higher level. And then, if you're interested, we'll look at the opportunity when it becomes available. After the call, Michelle sat in her office for a long time. The trajectory that Harrison was suggesting was extraordinary. It would take her from major to colonel to brigadier general to major general within a relatively short time frame, probably 5 to 7 years. Most officers took 20 or more years to reach that level. But she also understood that Harrison wasn't offering her something she didn't deserve. He was offering her a path that was available because she had proven her competence repeatedly, because her work had results that spoke for themselves, because she brought a perspective to military medicine that was valuable and innovative. That evening, she called her father. Her parents had both passed away years ago, her mother when Michelle was in her 20s, her father when she was in her 30s. But Michelle had a way of mentally checking in with them in major moments. Dad, she said to the memory of him, you used to tell me that I should never limit myself based on what I thought was possible. You said that possibility expands when you prove that the limited version of what's possible was wrong. I think I'm about to test that philosophy in a big way. The promotion to colonel came through a year later. It was a significant advancement and a clear indicator that Michelle was being positioned for even higher roles. The promotion ceremony was held at the Pentagon, and it was attended by high-ranking military leaders from multiple commands. General Harrison, though officially retired, attended the ceremony. Colonel Rodriguez, he said when he presented her with the colonel's insignia, you have transformed how the military approaches combat medicine. You've shown that expertise and competence are not bound by rank or service route. You're going to do great things in this new position. I have no doubt. After the ceremony, Harrison took Michelle aside privately. Next year, there's a position opening at Fort Bragg, he said. Deputy Director of Operations for Special Forces Command. It's a colonel-level position, and it's a stepping stone to higher positions. I want to make sure you're considered for it. Would you be interested? Yes, sir, Michelle said without hesitation. I would. Good, Harrison said. Because I think in another 3 years, you're going to be ready for positions that very few people get the opportunity to hold. And I want to make sure you're there when those opportunities come. Michelle realized in that moment that she was part of a larger transformation happening in the military. Leaders like General Harrison were deliberately working to change who rose to the highest levels of command, to ensure that advancement was based on competence and impact rather than just on traditional military paths. And she was being positioned as one of the examples that this change was possible. It was humbling, but it was also clarifying. She now understood that the work she had done, the training programs, the policy changes, the mentoring, that work wasn't just about making her own career better. It was about changing the system for everyone who came after her. That understanding made everything feel more meaningful. 5 years later, on a bright March morning, General Michelle Rodriguez stood in the Pentagon for the ceremony that would make her the Deputy Commander of United States Special Operations Command. The rank of Brigadier General sat on her shoulder, 1 star, representing a final validation of everything she had worked toward. The promotion ceremony was large and formal, held in the Joint Chiefs of Staff room at the Pentagon. She was surrounded by high-ranking officers from all branches of the military, by senior government officials, by people who had been influential in her career. General Harrison, now fully retired but still active in military circles, attended the ceremony and sat in the front row. The Secretary of Defense presented her with her general officer insignia. Brigadier General Rodriguez, he said, your career represents the very best of what military service can be. You have transformed how we approach combat medicine. You have demonstrated that leadership excellence is not bound by traditional career paths. You are an inspiration to everyone who serves. Congratulations. The ceremony ended, and Michelle stood in her dress uniform with the single star on her shoulder, feeling the weight of everything that had brought her to this moment. Later, she attended a small reception for family and friends. General Harrison pulled her aside. I want to show you something, he said, leading her to a quiet room in the Pentagon. On the wall was a photograph. It showed Michelle in her dress uniform, standing at the entrance to the Fort Bragg Medical Facility 15 years ago. Below it was a quote. They called her just a medic. She became a general officer, and along the way, she changed how an entire military institution valued the expertise of medical professionals. Her leadership proves that excellence is not determined by where you start, but by the dedication with which you do your work and the integrity with which you lead others. Michelle stared at the photograph and the quote. She didn't remember anyone taking that photo. She didn't know how it had been selected for this display. Where is this? She asked. Pentagon Corridor, Harrison said. In the section honoring breakthrough leaders in military medicine. Your photo was selected by the Army Medical Command as an example of transformational leadership. You should know that your career has become a teaching tool, Michelle. Medical schools are studying your protocols. Mentoring programs use your story as an example of how to advance despite obstacles. You've changed the institution. Michelle felt overwhelmed. She had always thought of herself as just doing her job, doing it well, trying to improve how things worked. She hadn't realized how much her individual actions had rippled through the entire system. That evening, she sat in her new office at the Pentagon, a far cry from the small medical facility office she'd worked in years ago, and reviewed her new responsibilities. As Deputy Commander of United States Special Operations Command, she would oversee medical operations for the entire Special Operations community across all service branches. She would advise the Commanding General on medical policy and strategic decisions. She would have authority over budgets, personnel, training standards, and operational medical support. It was a role that required her to think about military medicine at the highest strategic level. It was also a role that gave her the power to continue the work she'd started, to change the system, to elevate the status of combat medics, to ensure that expertise was recognized and rewarded regardless of rank or service background. The first thing she did in her new position was to establish the Michelle Rodriguez Mentorship Program for combat medical professionals aspiring to leadership roles. The program would provide training, education sponsorship, and career guidance to medics who wanted to advance beyond their current positions. The second thing she did was to propose a comprehensive review of how special operations units valued and deployed medical personnel. This review would examine not just whether medics were trained well, but whether they were being used effectively, whether their expertise was being fully leveraged, whether they had equal opportunities for advancement. The third thing she did was to invite Specialist James Chen, now Captain James Chen, to her office. James, she said, I want you to consider applying for your major's rank next year. I want you to eventually move into a command position. You have the knowledge, the experience, and the character to lead. And I want to make sure the system recognizes that. Yes, ma'am, James said, and Michelle could see the confidence in his expression. He had learned from her example that advancement was possible, that excellence was recognized, that an enlisted medical background could lead to officer positions of significant authority. Within 2 years, James had been promoted to major and assigned to a command position in special operations training. Within 5 years, he would be a colonel overseeing medical operations for a major command. But more importantly, he would mentor the next generation of medical professionals, passing on what he'd learned from Michelle about leadership, about excellence, about the importance of every person's contribution to the mission. The ripples continued to spread. On the 10th anniversary of her first commendation ceremony, Michelle received an invitation to speak at the Fort Bragg Special Forces Medical Facility where she had started her career. The invitation came from the commandant of the Special Forces Medical Training Program. She returned to Fort Bragg on a warm autumn day and stood in the medical facility where she had taught classes, where she had mentored younger medics, where she had developed her first training protocols. The auditorium was full. There were current medics, retired medics, officers, sergeants, young soldiers at the beginning of their careers. They had come to hear from someone who had started where they were and risen to the highest levels of military medicine. Michelle stood at the podium and looked out at the faces watching her. 10 years ago, I received my first commendation, she began. I was honored, but I was also confused. I didn't think I had done anything extraordinary. I was just doing my job. She paused and smiled at her own choice of words. I used that word, just. I was just a medic. And for a long time, that word defined how I saw myself and how the military system saw medics. We were support personnel. We were secondary to the combat troops. We were important, but not essential. We were just medics. She looked directly at the medics in the audience. Here's what I learned: there is no just in military service. There is expertise. There is dedication. There is the weight of responsibility that comes from knowing that your decisions affect whether people live or die. There is skill that takes years to develop and a commitment to continuous improvement. There is leadership, whether you're leading a single patient through a trauma situation or leading an entire command structure. There is no just. She talked about her own journey, the commendation that had given her the confidence to believe in herself, the mentors who had believed in her before she believed in herself, the work of developing expertise and continuing to grow even when that growth required going back to school, changing career paths, facing uncertainty. I want to tell you something important, she said, her voice strong. The military is changing. It's recognizing that excellence comes in many forms. It's understanding that expertise developed in the field is just as valuable as expertise developed through traditional officer pathways. It's starting to understand that women and enlisted personnel and people who didn't follow traditional paths can lead effectively and innovatively. She talked about the mentorship program, about the policy changes, about the young medics who were being promoted and advancing into leadership roles. But here's what I also want to tell you: that change only happened because individuals refused to accept limits. Because people like Captain Chen refused to believe they were just medics. Because people believed in themselves enough to pursue advanced training and new opportunities. Because leaders like General Harrison were willing to advocate for people based on competence rather than tradition. She paused and looked directly at the youngest soldiers in the auditorium. If you're here, if you're training to be a combat medic, you are not just anything. You are a professional. You are essential. You are the kind of person the military needs leading at the highest levels. Believe that. Act like it. And don't let anyone convince you otherwise. When she finished speaking, the standing ovation lasted for 3 minutes. Medics came up to her afterward to shake her hand, to tell her about how her story had inspired them, to ask her questions about how to pursue advancement. One young woman, a specialist who had recently enlisted, asked, "General Rodriguez, what if I'm not sure I have what it takes to advance that far?" Michelle thought about that question, about the self-doubt that came from being told, in 1,000 small ways, that you didn't belong in leadership. None of us are sure, she said. I wasn't sure. I still have moments of doubt. But here's what I know: if you do the work, if you develop your expertise, if you treat people with respect, if you lead with integrity, then you're qualified. The doubt is just noise. Don't let it stop you from becoming what you're capable of. That night, Michelle had dinner with Dr. Patricia Williams, the surgeon who had been instrumental in her career development years ago. They had stayed in touch throughout the years, had supported each other through various career transitions. I'm proud of you, Williams said simply. Not just for the promotions, though those are impressive. But for what you've done to change the system. You've made it possible for the next generation to advance without having to fight as hard as you did. That's exceptional leadership. I couldn't have done it without people like you, Michelle said. Without General Harrison. Without commanders who believed that competence mattered more than tradition. True, Williams agreed. But you had to believe in yourself first. That's what I think people miss when they look at your story. Yes, you had good mentors. Yes, you were recognized at the right moments. But you also had to take those opportunities and do something with them. You had to go back to school. You had to accept the field commission. You had to pursue the major's rank and the command position. Every step of the way, you had to believe that you deserved it. As Michelle drove back to the Pentagon the next day, she thought about that observation. It was true. Recognition and opportunity were important, but they were only the beginning. What mattered was what you did with the opportunity once you had it. 10 years from now, Michelle thought, there would be other women generals in the military. Not because of her personally, but because the door had been opened by her example and by people like her who had refused to accept that their background limited their potential. 20 years from now, the military would be different. Medical operations would be valued differently. Combat medics would be seen as essential leaders, not support personnel. Enlisted personnel would have clear pathways to officer positions. Women would be serving at the highest levels in numbers that reflected their capability. And it would be because people like Michelle had insisted on changing the system, one decision at a time, one trained medic at a time, one policy change at a time. The real power, she understood now, was not in the rank or the title. The real power was in having the authority to change how an entire institution functioned. The real power was in opening doors for the people who came after you, so they wouldn't have to fight as hard. That was the legacy she wanted to leave. A year after her promotion to Brigadier General, Michelle received another call from the Pentagon's Human Resources Office. There was another position becoming available. It was a major command position, higher than her current role, requiring a major general's rank. Would she be interested in being considered? Michelle said yes. She had learned to say yes to opportunities. She had learned that competence and dedication and integrity were enough. She had learned that the system could change if you pushed hard enough, if you had allies, if you refused to accept limits. She had learned that there was no such thing as, just a medic. There were only medics, skilled professionals who had earned their place through years of work, who deserved recognition and respect, who were essential to the military mission, who could lead effectively if given the opportunity. And she had learned that sometimes, you had to become a general officer to teach the entire military that lesson. But the most important lesson, the one she wanted to pass on to every person she mentored, every medic she trained, every soldier who felt overlooked or underestimated, was this. Your value is not determined by what others perceive. Your potential is not limited by where you start. Your leadership is not validated only by public recognition. Your value comes from inside, from the dedication and integrity with which you do your work, from the commitment to excellence that drives you to improve constantly, from the willingness to help others succeed. Everything else, the ranks, the recognition, the advancement, those things follow when you've done the real work of becoming excellent at what you do. And if they don't follow? If the system is slow to recognize what you know about yourself, then you believe in yourself anyway. You do the work anyway. You help others believe in themselves anyway. Because that's what true leadership is.